Boulder and Rock were outside of the colony, outside of the cave. They were gathering berries, and they were gathering nuts. It was their designated task, their duty. This colony was more advanced than many of the others, as they had put in some additional practices, such as planting various crops, like potatoes, carrots, and other such things, in order to make broths, stews, and soups. Boulder and Rock were troubled. The whole colony was troubled. They may have done some different things, but there were still problems, such as the workers getting weak inside the caves due to various things. And their little buddy Rex, one of the youngest, if not the youngest, in the colony, a stalactite on the ceiling had fallen and slammed into him. Well, it skid him, but it caused a very bad slash. A few inches to the right would have killed him if would have killed Rex or impaled into some internal organs. Boulder and Rock were troubled by this. They knew their little buddy was hurt and injured. They did what little they could. They didn't know barely, if not anything, about the medical techniques and knowledge in order to treat such wounds. It was a slash, it wasn't a puncture wound, meaning it didn't stab. However, the slash was rather large, which meant it could get infected. So what they had done is they had simply washed it out with water that had been purified and bandaged. This was indeed not a bad idea. However, if they had had something better, this would have gone better, of course, to assure that an infection had not sprung. And there was the problem with the workers inside, coughing and wheezing, feeling a tightness in their chests they hadn't before. Boulder and Rock were discussing their feelings towards the fact that Rex could indeed die if an infection had occurred. The body of diamond dogs were strong. However, sometimes the immune system couldn't fight off these foreign objects that were inside of the body. They couldn't entirely fight them back, as it would overwhelm them and kill them in a matter of minutes. Maybe even days if they're lucky to survive that long. However, all this was soon to change for their colony. Not far away from the berry bush they were picking, a being had awoken. The doctor opened his eyes slowly to the blinding light of the sky. His head was in a haze, felt like it was spinning back and forth and around. He didn't know what to think, what to feel of this. It was a different and alien feeling. It was almost like his eyes snapped open as he lurched himself up. He took a deep breath and realized he didn't have the plague, but he remembered what had happened. He was among many of the plague doctors. Many of the plague doctors were poorly educated and knew very little of how to help people. However, this doctor was different. He would read books, go to actual doctors, get advice, gain more knowledge through different medical theories. Through different medical theories and various medical techniques that helped him on the field deal with the plague and the illness. He had surprisingly saved many lives in his wake. Once he'd even saved 3 towns. However, heroes experience tragedy. His family had died from the plague. He knew this. He sat there in a sitting position with his elbows on his knees, sitting there crouched. He took a deep breath, rubbed the side of his head where his hood met his mask. He inhaled deeply. The herbs and the various flowers in his beak he smelt. He had a soft smile. He killed himself. That's why he was here. He ended his life. But that was a sin. How was he not in hell? Then he remembered. God, he'd met him. God had given him a second chance, filled him with the medical knowledge of an alternate universe. Filled him with medical knowledge that was vastly different. He was up to date on what many would call modern or advanced medicine, not futuristic. God told him that he would fill him with the knowledge of an earth where it was the year 2019. And in 2019 he would be filled with every little bit of medical knowledge and history, and even the new discoveries, so he would never stop learning about the medical history. His God had also granted him a few other perks as well. The ability to defend himself. However, that was a secret. He'd also given him another ability which he kept secret. He didn't tell him, nor did the doctor ask. It was far-fetched in his mind. I mean, he could have ended up killing himself and ended up in this as a heaven. He could be in some induced coma from losing so much blood, and people had saved him. There was a number of things that could have happened. Maybe he had hallucinated, and now he was out in the middle of nowhere. Maybe his family didn't die after all. He inhaled again, pushed himself up. His robe swayed slightly. He had his staff, which he used as a walking stick, and began walking through. He had a small little satchel on the side of his hip, a few of them in fact, and he had a traveling pack on his back. He looked around. He spotted many different things, and he decided to gather. He knelt down and began gathering herbs and various flowers. He looked in his pack, and there was a few things in there. There was alcohol in there. There was also soap. And there was bandages. There was many different kinds of things. Even some things he didn't know what they were called. He shrugged it and began walking. He even found something called a blood transfusion kit, whatever that is. Then it snapped to his mind. He immediately knew what a blood transfusion kit was for. It was weird. He had never seen this technology before. He shrugged it and just thought of it as good luck. He remembered that He remembered that somehow, he didn't know how or what it meant, but he also did know what it meant. It was crazy. He remembered his blood type. He begins to think and remembers it was O something. But he does remember that his blood type can be given to any other human being and it wouldn't matter. As he began walking, he saw bushes rustling with a few creatures there. He saw what looked like maybe dogs, but they were hunched and talking to each other. He did a double take. They were talking. Like actually talking. He took a deep breath and decided, fuck it. He'd never used such vulgar language, but in this situation where in his mind he believed he somehow became the prodigy of a god, or he ended up killing himself, didn't matter. He went over. Greetings. Before anything could happen, they both yanked their heads and looked at him. Boulder and Rock grabbed their spears that were on the floor, that he hadn't noticed because the grass was slightly tall, and aimed it at the thing. This weird thing, wearing this weird outfit, staring at them in a weird way. Did they mention that it was kind of weird? They said, "What are you? You beast," he said as he inched forward, nudging the spear in a threatening way. The doctor stood his ground and said, "Please, I am not here to cause any harm. I am simply wondering as to where I am." They stared at each other and looked at this thing and smirked. They could easily chain this thing up and use it in the mines. The doctor saw smirks on their faces, knowing that they had malicious intent. He grasped both of his hands on his staff and said, "I do not wish to fight you. Look, how about this? In exchange for you providing me information, I can offer you my services." They both looked at him and said, "Oh yeah? And what exactly would that be, What services would you provide us that would be of any use besides mining gems?" "Well, I am a doctor, of course. Surely in a mine there's many problems and symptoms that come about, such as black lung. I may not be able to cure some of these things, but I am indeed capable of providing preventions and providing the necessary treatment for this." They thought about this. If this thing was truly a doctor, it could help Rex, their little buddy. "All right. Fine. We'll tell you what you want. We'll answer any questions, but you come with us." He stared and said, "Of course. I will come with you." He got the bird bipedal thing, got in front of them, and began walking as they pointed the direction for him to walk. As they approached the oncoming cave, the others looked in confusion. And were bewildered and shocked at this thing. The doctor walked inside. The darkness made him familiar. It reminded him of the skies that he would walk under, that had the very, very a vague scent of death, as the herbs and flowers would block it, with their sweet, alluring smell. The mistress of death would lull many of the victims into eternal sleep. But this was not the case with him, however, as he was a man, a scientist, of sorts, a doctor, most definitely. He said, "All right, I will begin my work. Where is the patient?" They brought the man deeper down into the mine. Eventually they came to a door. The floor was slightly smoothed, only slightly. The walls were very rough, along with the ceiling that had a few stalactites that were rather sharp. He conceived that this was an immediate safety hazard, and could result in a fatality, if not careful. They opened the door and he walked in. What greeted him was not horrifying. He had seen some very, very horrifying things in the day of the plague. He stared. They were all laying down on bunks, laying down on medical benches or stretchers, as some would say. Many were hacking and coughing, and a few had bandages wrapped. The doctor sighed, and immediately went over to the one that seemed in the most critical condition, which surprisingly was Rex. Boulder and Rock took note. The doctor sat down in front of Rex, who tensed, looking at the thing, and said, "Rock, Boulder, get this freak away from me." They looked and said, "Calm down, Rex. He's here to help. Try anything funny, and you'll end with a spear in your throat." The doctor didn't do anything, not even flinch, which kind of unnerved them a little. Because that's exactly how he killed himself. He slammed a knife in his throat and yanked. He wasn't afraid to die twice. He sat down and undid the bandages, looking at the wound. Surely enough, there was no sign of infection, but there would be if not treated soon. He then said, "Water. I need water." That's when they said, "Look, bud, we already did that. If you're not gonna..." He slammed his hand on the desk. "I said water. Now!" They went off and grabbed water in a hurried pace. They set it down next to him. Then he did this. He took a clean cloth that he had from his bag and and then he grabbed a bar of soap and tossed it in the bucket. After a little bit, he pulled the soap out and put it back in his bag into a separate little container, put the cloth in, and said, "Do any of you have any leather by chance?" We have this hide." "Good. Hand it over." He grabbed the hide and put it in Rex's mouth and said, "This is going to hurt a lot. What I'm going to need you to do is to bite down on this, as if to not grind your teeth, and break, chip, or shatter them." He ran the cloth over the wound in order to clean it, as to clean the fur and clean the wound itself. As so, when he poured the alcohol on it, his attempts were not in vain. Once the wound was clean and the whimpering and cries from Rex stopped, he pulled out the alcohol, uncapped it, and poured it onto the wound. It sizzled. A lot. The entire wound sizzled. And Rex was breathing through the hide. That's whenever he looked at him and said, "Now, Rex, as he began to get a closer look at it. He tapped his chin and remembered he had something. He looked into his bag and saw it. He didn't know how he got his hands on such technology. But then he thought, he remembered, maybe that was his power. To be able to grab anything he needed that would medically help him. Or maybe it was already there and he was stupid. He read the label, antibiotic ointment. Antibiotic ointment was a very specific thing. It was used to be rubbed on a wound in order to treat it, to ensure, most definitely, that infection would not occur. That would kill off most bacteria. Even if it was good, it would still kill it. But it was a necessary risk and precaution that needed to be taken. It was also known to be a pain reliever. So what he did he took off one glove. He was beginning to, but shook his head. Better safe than sorry. He kept the glove on, poured a decent amount onto his glove, and began smothering it onto the wound. Then after it was done, he took a bandage and began wrapping it around, and tightened it just slightly for good measure. Not enough to cause discomfort, and not enough to rip it. Just enough to keep it firm. He then stood up and stared at his work and said, "Now." The dog looked up to him and he said, "Exactly when did this happen?" Rex looked and said, "It happened about yesterday." He nodded. That's when he nodded and said, all right." That's when he reached into his bag and pulled out an herb that was well known. This type of herb was used to make melatonin. And the pill was basically a natural aid and it was there in order to help get sleep most indefinitely. He told Rex to eat the pill, which he did, and swallowed. After a little bit, he fell asleep. That is when the doctor got up and began treating the other patients. The doctor smiled, knowing that the plague wasn't here. He wouldn't have to worry about it. The one thing that was most deadly here was respiratory, basically black lung and other such things. So that's when he walked up and began writing a chart that said, wear a mask, wash dust off exposed skin, wash face and hands before eating, drinking, or taking any kind of medicine, and handed it over to them and said, "This should work. These are safety standards for working in such environments such as this. As you will eventually run into coal and many other things, you will come in contact with dust. There is currently no treatment for such things, but what I can issue you is this." He had held out a device. This device was a poor creation of an inhaler. It was basically a simple device that would force air into the body. Basically just getting oxygen into the system so they could breathe more efficiently. It was a low quality inhaler, but an inhaler. He was just hoping they didn't end up with COPD or lung cancer. Most of them had coughing. Most of them complained of coughing, or having shortnesses of breath, or even chest tightness. These were common symptoms of black lung. And he was hoping for their sake that it didn't cause scarring in the lungs. He wasn't exactly in any measure to perform a lung transplant. He then said, after a long days of work, as of treating wounds and helping those who couldn't help themselves, helping many who were in relatively dangerous states, he was able to help many of them. He brought most of those who were infected outside. Actually, pretty much the entire bay where the sick were resting outside into the air. He put them and made the dogs make a tent. And put a small little fire pit in the tent, in a safe distance, and where the smoke would come out of a small hole in the top. It was filtered. This way it would provide heat. It was the best thing he could do. He took a deep breath and went and laid down. The others were staring at him with a newfound respect. Before they thought of him as a freak, but the willingness he was willing to do to give up his supply in order to help them was indefinite and grateful. They would answer his questions tomorrow. They owed him that much.